walking down a deserted street at dusk. A ringing echoes out of an ancient telephone booth. You ignore the call and continue on your way. Later that night, violent pounding on your front door awakens you. A high-pitched, mocking voice shouts, "Why didn't you answer my call?" You need my help. This is A Voice from Darkness. Hello to all our listeners. This is Dr. Malcolm Ryder, parapsychologist. And if you're hearing this, it's because you subscribed for special, exclusive episodes of our show. Let me take a moment before we begin to thank you for your support. It's because of you we're able to continue making this show. For these bonus episodes, for the time being anyway, we're going to focus on questions from you, our listeners, as well as Today in Odd America segments. We'll also be trying out new features in the coming months and asking you for your opinions on these. Being some of our most dedicated listeners as you are, we truly value your feedback. We'll go into that at another time, though. Onward to tonight's episode. This evening, it's a very Chicago-focused show. We have 2 questions from listeners about my hometown, and our Today in Odd America segment starts in the Windy City, though it's truly about elsewhere. Let's delve into our questions from you, our listeners. Our first question comes via email. It reads, "Hey, Ryder, I don't have a supernatural question, but settle a bet between me and my girlfriend. Who makes the best deep dish in Chicago? Lou Malnati's or Giordano's?" From Evan. Well, Evan, I hate to disappoint you and your girlfriend, but I'm not actually a big fan of Chicago-style pizza. I hope that doesn't get me run out of the city. When I'm craving a slice, there's a Neapolitan place not terribly far from me. Now, I will say, on those rare occasions when I am in the mood for deep dish, I'll typically go to Pequot's. Their caramelized crust is delicious. Once again, sorry, Evan, that I can't properly settle your bet, but I hope my honest answer to your question is sufficient. Our next question is also about Chicago, though, thankfully, more supernatural in nature. Dr. Ryder, Maria writes, "Have you ever been to the odd-shaped room?" The short answer to your question, Maria, is no. I've never had the pleasure. I've talked to many who have. Due to the nature of my work and the fact that I live in the city, Chicagoans love to tell me their own tales of the fabled bar. For those of you who are unaware, there's an infamous drinking establishment here in Chicago. One whose door will only open for you once, will only appear for you once, and never again. The odd-shaped room might materialize anywhere in the city. All who visit it describe it as busy but never crowded. There's always seats available at the bar, in private booths or tables scattered about the floor. Several archetypal characters make frequent appearances across hundreds, if not thousands, of witness statements about their visits to this singular place. Of course, there's the bartenders themselves. One a stout, red-haired man in his mid-50s with a faint Irish accent. The other a tall, Turkish woman, somewhere between her late 20s and early 30s. The red-haired man will offer you beer or whiskey, but nothing else if you approach him. The Turkish woman, on the other hand, will offer to make you a cocktail. The cocktails she makes you've never heard of and will not be able to find anywhere else in the world. You must be careful when you first approach the bar. Whoever you get drinks from first will be your bartender for the rest of your time there. The other will refuse to serve you. Many in Chicago know as much as I've told you so far, and so many make the mistake of walking up to the Turkish woman and asking for a cocktail. I say mistake not because something miserable will befall you for this decision. No, simply because the choice isn't made with all the information available. If you want your one and only experience in this magical place to be about a singular pleasure that can be experienced only once, then by all means ask the Turkish woman for a drink. But like many, if you stumble your way into the odd-shaped room with a problem weighing you down, then consider asking the red-haired man for either a beer, glass of whiskey, or both, as he's less distracted by the beverages he supplies. He tends to be a patient and sympathetic listener. Many folks credit life-changing decisions they've made from epiphanies they had while talking with the red-haired bartender. There are others in the bar, too, who are likely not real, or not real in the way you and I are. We usually label such beings as archetypes, though what they're archetypical of is unknown. There's an elderly man in a booth with a backgammon board. If you choose to spend your evening playing him and win, you'll likely live over 100 years. At least there's 8 such documented cases. If you lose, is there a consequence? Is your life made shorter? Who's to say? There's a young woman who sits alone at a table with a book and a club soda. Should you buy her a drink, any drink, other than what she currently has, she'll offer to read the lines on the palm of your hand. Be warned, though, her reading will be accurate. There's many other such archetypes who haunt the odd-shaped room. Especially if you live in the city, I encourage you to learn about them to prepare for your own possible encounters. I'll leave it to you to discover the rest. However, I'll finish with one warning. Beware the woman with white hair and almond eyes. The bar is L-shaped, and she'll always sit near the corner at the top of the L. If you speak to her, if you make eye contact with her, she may follow you out of the bar. I won't say what would then happen, but I assure you, it wouldn't be pleasant. And that's all for our questions this evening. Onward to Today in Odd America. Today in Odd America, we find ourselves in the town of Chambers, Kansas, the year 1895. A cartographer by the name of Marcus Philibrown arrived in Chambers by stagecoach. He'd traveled all the way from Chicago after receiving a strange letter from a local schoolteacher. The letter informed the company Mr. Philibrown worked for, Patriotic Map and Globe, that there was a mistake on the map of the United States they printed for schoolhouses. Chambers, Kansas was right on the western border, not 2 hours away by horseback from Colorado. There was a single road that led out of town in that direction. The letter insisted that depending on how you traveled out of Chambers, by horse or by foot, you ended up in 2 different locations. If you traveled west on horseback, you'd cross the border into Colorado. But if you walked that same road, specifically walked it at dusk and through the night, you'd end up elsewhere. Somewhere that no one in Chambers believed was part of America. Marcus Philibrown was 64 years old when he came to the small Kansas town. He'd worked in cartography since the age of 14. He'd drawn new states into the Union and added hundreds of cities and towns to maps as Americans moved westward. He had saved some money up from all his working years and was considering retirement as he felt there was nothing new for him to do in his field. But this absurd letter sparked his interest. Oh, sure, it was likely a hoax, one meant to attract tourists to the region, no doubt. But it was one last excuse to go out into the field, travel by train, by wagon, by horse, and by foot. And, if nothing else, it'd provide him with one more anecdote to tell in his retirement. Marcus did not stay long in Chambers. He sent a brief letter back home to his wife, telling her of his safe arrival and how he planned to set off the next evening by foot down the westward road out of town and into the unknown. He was traveling light, taking with him only a satchel filled with his professional tools, a skin of water, a blanket, and a pistol. A few of the local men promised to escort him for several miles, but not past midnight. They told him if he walks back the same road eastward at noon, he'd find his way back to Chambers by dusk. They warned him not to linger too long in this other place, as some never came back. They said all that and wished him safe travels. And that was the last we heard of Marcus Philibrown. At least until 19 years later in 1914, when the body of the 83-year-old cartographer was discovered face down in a muddy ravine in the Welsh woods of Oregon. It's impossible to say with certainty what happened to Philibrown in those 19 years, but among his possessions was a leather-bound journal where he'd recorded his thoughts, events, drawings, and attempts at mapping locations. Locations not part of the United States in any way, shape, or form. Patriotic Map and Globe went out of business in 1908. All company assets were sold to Little Brown and Company Publishing. Little Brown was shipped Philibrown's journal, and they, for reasons unknown, decided to publish a replica of the book with the ominous title, The Cartography of Shadows. The first entry details Philibrown arriving at a lonely inn several hours after leaving the company of his Chambers escorts. According to Philibrown, the stars in the sky glue black, which set him on edge. He was a reasonably educated man and couldn't think of a single natural explanation for their strange appearance. The inn only had one dim kerosene lantern outside near the sign to make itself known. Inside was a dark-haired woman behind a desk. Elderly men held playing cards in their hands, but made no effort to do much else with them. "Am I in Colorado?" Philibrown asked. "No," the dark-haired woman said. "You're at the edge of the forest and shadow." She looked him over. "Are you a refugee from Farbotia?" "I'm American from Chicago," Philibrown replied. "You came from the east?" the woman asked. Philibrown nodded. "Only thing back that way is lost Farbotia." Philibrown didn't argue with the woman further. He was tired and inquired about accommodations. The woman took him to an empty room and refused payment from him. She said it was bad luck to accept Farbotian coins. He spent the night dreaming of black stars. "The color of absence," he wrote in his journal. And behind them, he felt something staring back. Philip Brown didn't wake until well past noon. He rushed from the inn at the edge of forest and shadow and made his way back eastward. The stars, his dream. It was as much as he wanted to experience of this place, wherever it was. If he was simply in Colorado and the butt of a joke, he didn't care. He walked for hours. At a certain point, it became clear he was not in Kansas, nor Colorado, but somewhere else entirely. The setting sun highlighted far in the distance the desolate and decaying structures of an abandoned empire. From a small hill, Philip Brown peered across the land with his binoculars. Grand marble palaces were crumbled into ruins. Spiraling towers lay collapsed across the earth. Hidden among the wreckage were odd creatures stalking about. Misshapen beings, resembling humans only in the most uncharitable ways. These creatures frightened him, and so he turned back and traveled once again through the night to the inn at the edge of forest and shadow. When he arrived, he sat down near the card players and requested a drink, beer, wine, anything to dull his senses. "American?" one of the card players asked. Philip Brown replied he was. "Thought I heard you say that the other night. We all are, we three. From Kansas, trapped here. Didn't get back in time." "What do you mean?" Philip Brown asked. "The road. You only get one shot to come back here and go back. You messed up. We all did. Don't worry, though. It's not so bad." Philip Brown took a studied look at the card players. Their eyes were dull, lifeless. Their skin wrinkled with deep crevices and with a wax-like texture. They scarcely moved at all. The innkeeper asked Philip Brown if he'd be staying with his new friends. "No," he said. "I'll be taking my chances with the road westward." What follows in the journal are hundreds of vignettes that take place in a vast and surreal place called the Forest and Shadow. The stories he tells of this place take all different forms. Some read as dark fairy tales, others more akin to moralizing Aesop's fables. Philip Brown claims to have encountered more than one talking animal in this place. I will not repeat Philip Brown's tales from this section of his book at this time. There's much debate on if they're a true and honest account of events, which seems unlikely, or perhaps he'd gone mad and simply wandered the western half of the country for years and years. If he did go mad, he at least never lost his talent as an artist. One illustration in particular, a burned skeleton nailed to a tree, clutching a candlestick in one hand, and with a melted wax crown, sends a chill down my spine every time I look at it. Partway into his journal, after being in the forest and shadow for 9 years, he meets a woman who speaks a strange language. Despite not sharing a common tongue, she invites him back to her home deep in the forest. All entries after that night are written in an indecipherable text, the first in a frantic scrawl, as if Philip Brown was profoundly upset. Some believe Philip Brown was either killed or had the book stolen at this point, and it's a different person writing altogether, though they too illustrate and draw maps much in the same style as Philip Brown. The most likely explanation, I believe, is Philip Brown had relations with the woman, and the remainder of the journal is written in the sexually transmitted language of Flynn. Lost Farbotia, the sexually transmitted language of Flynn, the Candlestick King. All of these subjects have been mentioned previously on our show. And here they all are, together. There are many who call the cartography of shadows the Rosetta Stone of the supernatural. That if you were to understand all of what Marcus Philip Brown documented in his 19 years of wandering, you would fully comprehend all the otherworldly things that manifest across our country. I'm not sure I buy into this line of reasoning, but certainly there's appeal. And in the coming months, we'll see even more connections between the cartography of shadows and the history of our wide and lonely country. In our next Patreon episode, we'll explore the Welsh woods of Oregon where Philip Brown's body was discovered. But that's all for now. Well, that's our show for this evening. Thank you once again for subscribing to us on Patreon. If you would like a question asked and answered on the show, please check our Patreon page for instructions. We'll have another Patreon episode in a month, but in 2 weeks, we'll be back with a full episode with callers, which you can access from wherever you normally hear us. So, remember, if you're experiencing anything supernatural, paranormal, or otherworldly, feel free to call or write in. Next time on A Voice from Darkness.
Thank you for listening to A Voice from Darkness and subscribing to our Patreon. As always, that was Kristin Holland as Dr. Malcolm Ryder. If you enjoy his work, check out his horror anthology podcast, Nocturnal Transmissions, available wherever you normally get your podcasts. In a few weeks, we'll be starting new episodes of our show on our regular podcast feed. In our first episode, you'll meet Professor Amelia Ryder, Malcolm's sister, for the first time, though you might recognize the voice actress playing her. Until then, I'm Jack Rhys. Thank you for listening.